By the way, George was a heck of a fine painter. That's his own self-portrait. He drew a nice portrait of Jerome Kern. He did a very nice portrait of some classical composers. Really good. Let's begin with just a few one-sentence anecdotes to tell you something about George's self-confidence, self-assurance. Some might call it arrogance. The pianist and neurotic wit Oscar Levant once asked the composer in private, "Tell me, George, if you had to do it all over again, would you fall in love with yourself again?" And the second was, when George wondered if his music would be played in 100 years, Levant replied, "It certainly will be if you're still alive." George was not shy, one must say that. We start with an overture. This is the overture of the elephant in Gershwin's output, his most celebrated and popular work, the Rhapsody in Blue. When Woody Allen was filming his masterpiece in New York City, Manhattan, in 1979, he used Gershwin's music throughout, nobody else's music. And the opening credits were right over a very small part of the Rhapsody in Blue, the beginning and the end. So I thought we'd watch that since it is an overture, and we're ready for that. We missed the glissando. Don't worry about it.
Chapter 1. He adored New York City. He idolized it all out of proportion. He romanticized it all out of proportion. Better. To him, no matter what the season was, this was still a town that existed in black and white and pulsated to the great tunes of George Gershwin. Let me start this over. Chapter 1. He was too romantic about Manhattan, as he was about everything else. He thrived on the hustle-bustle of the crowds and the traffic. To him, New York meant beautiful women and street-smart guys who seemed to know all the angles. Too corny for my taste. Let me try and make it more profound. Chapter 1. He adored New York City. To him, it was a metaphor for the decay of contemporary culture. The same lack of individual integrity that caused so many people to take the easy way out was rapidly turning the town of his dreams and... it's going to be too preachy. Let's face it, I want to sell some books here. Chapter 1. He adored New York City. Although to him, it was a metaphor for the decay of contemporary culture. How hard it was to exist in a society desensitized by drugs, loud music, television, crime, garbage. Too angry. I don't want to be angry. Chapter 1. He was as tough and romantic as the city he loved. Behind his black-rimmed glasses was the coiled sexual power of a jungle cat. Oh, I love this. New York was his town. And it always would be.
was also George Gershwin's town, and it always would be. He and New York were born the same year, and they were born in the same place. It was in 1898 that the independent city of Brooklyn was amalgamated with Manhattan to form Greater New York and complete the 5 boroughs. On September 27, 1898, Jacob Gershwin was born in Brooklyn. By the way, I was born in Brooklyn, but no one cares. To Moishe Gershowitz and Rosa Brushkin, recent Jewish immigrants from urban Russia. Moishe arrived in 1890 and Rosa 2 years later. There were 4 children in the family. Jacob, who was soon Americanized to George, was the second child. The eldest was Israel, who became Ira, born 2 years before George, and Arthur and Francis arrived later. Sometime between the birth of Ira and George, the name was changed from Gershowitz to Gershwin. By the way, Gershwin's birth certificate says Gershwin with an E at the end, but nobody really thinks that was anything but a misspelling. Morris was a hard and energetic worker at many occupations. He was a shoemaker, he managed a pool hall, he was a bookie, he owned a cigar store, and therefore the family moved around a whole lot. Ira once wrote that in his youth they lived in 28 different residences. But it wouldn't be accurate to judge the family as suffering from the tedious poverty of tenement life. Morris's resume may have been lengthy, but he always saw to it the family was well provided. The lyricist Yip Harburg, a family friend, wrote that, quote, "Compared to most of us, the Gershwins were affluent." It was not a religious family. Only Ira was bar mitzvahed, and the family rarely attended religious services. You have to remember, the parents were born in urban Russia, not on a shtetl, and there was a very different social group that they belonged to. The Jewish heritage was present in George, but it could not be considered in any way dominant. The writer Carl van Vechten wrote, "It's absurd to talk about Jewish tradition in George Gershwin. There was nothing notably Jewish in him at all. Why, we never thought about it." School, like with Biederbeck and with Ellington, was entirely unimportant to George. Ira was the studious one in the family, the scholar. George cared nothing for school, and when he was 15, he dropped out to begin a career in music. Second in status only to a high school diploma in a recent immigrant family was a piano, second-hand piano normally. Thus it was that a piano was lifted up and through the second-floor window of the Gershwin apartment. And given how often they moved, one could imagine that coming down and back up and then down and back up many times. I assume they bought a very well put together second-hand piano. The piano was for Ira. He was the oldest one, he was the studious one, and then maybe George would pick it up later. But nobody was happier than Ira when George sat down at the piano and began to play. He had learned some songs playing the piano in some other friends' houses, but nobody knew of it. So Ira said, "Good, you play, I read." Well, he was 15. What are you going to do at 15? Well, he was hired as a song plugger for the Jerome H. Remick Corporation. Oh, I'm sorry, one more. Oops, there we go. In those pre-radio and silent movie days, song pluggers were critical to a publishing industry. They would make the rounds of watering holes, vaudeville houses, and cafes, seeking to convince performers to add a Remick song into their repertoire. George hated working as a song plugger. He found it tedious, and his young but already well-developed ego didn't much like being condescended to by the performers. But he was paid reasonably well and nothing better on offer. He stayed there for 3 years until he was 18. To keep busy and earn a few more dollars, he began to make piano rolls, which he continued to do throughout his career. And the piano rolls are clearly the earliest thing we have as to his piano style. You have to think that in those days, George was a pianist and not a composer. The first complete and surviving instrumental composition of George's was 1916's Rialto Ripple's Rag. Remick published it in 1917, the only time he managed to get his employer to publish any of his songs. 40 years later, it became the theme song. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Ernie Kovacs show of the late 50s, but it was probably the most creative, idiosyncratic, and revolutionary show on television at its time. And since we did opening credits before, let's try some closing credits from the Ernie Kovacs show using the rag.
Bet you thought it was your set. Just me, I have a slow focus. Okay, Ted.
Okay, stand by, please.
Ernie was quite a funny guy, but he was one of the worst gambling addicts you could possibly imagine. When he died, his wife, Edie Adams, had to pay off all his debts and take care of the children that he did not leave any money for. Good woman. I consider it a driving and vibrant piano rag with nothing particularly special about it, but for his first piece, I think it's quite good. The supremely confident young man departed Remick, certain that he could find something else pretty quickly. He was 18 and unemployed, but as we will come to see, Gershwin always managed to land on his feet. His reputation as a composer remained negligible at the time, but he had achieved a great deal of fame in New York City as a first-rate pianist by the age of 18. In the immediate post-Remick months, he walked the streets on Tin Pan Alley looking for someone to manage him, and didn't get anywhere. But someone named Florence Ziegfeld approached him in 1917 and to serve as a rehearsal pianist for his new revue, Miss 1917. The score was by such high flyers as Victor Herbert and Jerome Kern, and the book was written by P.G. Wodehouse. It was quite an excellent play. The cast was an all-star team of Vivian Siegel, Lou Fields, Irene Castle, and the dance team of Ann Pennington and George White. To attest that excellent ingredients do not always make a tasty stew, the review was criticized as a lamentable mishmash and bombed. Wodehouse later wrote, "There was only one thing about Miss 1917 that is of historic interest. The boy who played the piano at rehearsals was a young fellow named George Gershwin." From that work as a rehearsal pianist, one of the stars, Vivian Siegel, got a Sunday night concert together. Sunday nights were the nights when people who were on Broadway got to do something extra because all the shows were closed. So you could make a few extra bucks. She went to play some of Gershwin's songs and hired Gershwin to be her pianist. And again, Gershwin, being a somewhat lucky person, found a great job there. In addition, in the audience at the time was Max Dreyfus. Max Dreyfus was the president and CEO of the T.B. Harms Publishing Company, which was the most important and powerful of its time. So he's playing on a Sunday night, Dreyfus sees him, the next thing he knows he has a contract with Harms. Harms didn't want him to do anything of song plugging. Harms said to him, "Sit down, write music, if there's anything good, we'll publish it." George loved the job description. George was a lucky man. Young George could always find employment as a pianist. Among the things he did in 1918 were accompanying vaudeville stars such as Louise Dresser and Nora Bayes on national tours. He became a rehearsal pianist for a Jerome Kern musical, and Ziegfeld selected him to be his rehearsal pianist for the Ziegfeld Follies. George was now surrounded by superstars such as Eddie Cantor, W.C. Fields, Will Rogers, Ann Pennington, and Marilyn Miller. He had reached the top of the pyramid as a rehearsal pianist. Now his ambition was tightly focused on a much greater peak. In 1919, George's days as a rehearsal pianist were over once and for all. He got together with another childhood friend, Irving Caesar, who was a well-known lyricist, and George and he sat down deliberately to write a hit song. I suppose a lot of people do that, but he did it. They wrote in a popular two-step mode and in a trendy Dixie theme. What they had come up with was Swanee. Next. I'm going real slow here, aren't I? Sorry.
Can we go to the next one?
Let him watch that for a second. We'll move up in another minute. What they had come up with was Swanee. Harms liked it well enough to publish it immediately, but it languished for a while until Lucky George was playing piano at a party, and who was there but Al Jolson? By the way, if you invited George Gershwin to a party or a salon, don't bother hiring any kind of entertainment. George would walk in the door, grab a drink, sit down at the piano, and then have the rest of his drinks delivered because he would never get up. For 2 hours, for 3 hours, however long it took, George was there with his beloved piano. Jolson liked the song, and he was currently in a large hit called Sinbad. Among the hits in Sinbad was a blackface reading of Rockabye Your Baby with a Dixie melody. Jolson immediately interpolated Gershwin's new song into Sinbad and recorded it for Columbia in January of 1920. Suddenly, George Gershwin found himself exactly where he expected he would be, and even at the age he thought he would be. He was a composer of a major hit. It was not only his first triumph, it was also his biggest. The royalties began to flow in. George was only 21 years old, but had already made his mark and was ready to take on the world. The deeply striving George Gershwin craved success, he craved fame, he craved fortune and recognition, and now he had attained all four of them. It was a remarkable debut. Similar, I guess, to Berlin's Alexander Ragtime Band, which also moved his career on a fast track. Naturally, you'll all want to hear Al Jolson singing Swanee, because you never have. This clip is from a typically appalling Hollywood biography of 1945 called Rhapsody in Blue. The brief intro is of Robert Alda promising to write a hit song for Joan Leslie. You may remember Joan Leslie as the future wife of George M. Cohan in James Cagney's role. So apparently this woman who came to Hollywood to be something of a sexy woman became the girl next door you married in several movies. Swanee.
What are you, Miss Jolson?
When you lost your job?
Oh, yes. I see you're working at last.
In the chorus, but I'm understudying a part.
You'll get parts if I have to write them for you.
I knew it was your song. Good luck.
Thanks.
Well, George, you'll know in a minute.
I've been away from you a long time. I never thought I'd miss you so. Somehow I feel your love is real. Near you I want to be. The birds are singing, it is song time. The banjo's strumming soft and low. I know that you yearn for me too. Swanee, you're calling me. Swanee, how I love you, my dear old Swanee. I'd give the world to be among the folks here. G-I-X, I even know my mammy's waiting for me, praying for me down by the Swanee. The folks up north won't see me no more when I get to that Swanee shore. How I love you, my dear old Swanee. I'd give the world to be among the folks my mammies, waiting for me, praying for me down by the Swanee. The folks up north won't see me no more when I get to that Swanee.
You should be happy, Rose.
I am happy.
That was great, Al.
Thanks. Get in, kid. Write more songs like that and your name will be up in electric lights. Thanks, Al. Now I'll do some still better than that.
Well, George was now free from any agonizing about whether or not he would ever succeed. For 19 or 20 years, he had been struggling ever since he was born, and now he's made it. It had taken long enough, and his mind probably took too long. It was time now to turn his attention and ambition to writing for the most dominant, musical, and lucrative genre of his time, the Broadway Revue, spelled with a U-E. A revue refers to any theatrical show featuring a group of performers showcasing a variety of musical and comic forms. The story was entirely optional.
Notice his hair in that.
Alex Ahrens, the youthful son of a well-known Broadway impresario, aspired to set out on a Broadway producer's career. Like George, he was young and he was ambitious, and only 7 years older than George. It was the beginning of a beautiful partnership. A man who had yet to write his first score had teamed up with a man who had yet to produce his first show. They remained associated for 15 years, adding soon enough the team of Ira Gershwin and Ahrens' partner Vinton Friedli. In 1919, the year of Swanee, George wrote his first score for Ahrens, a comic revue with lyrics by Buddy DeSilva called La La Lucille. La La Lucille was favorably reviewed, and the show was on its way to probable financial success when it ran into the strike of the Actors Equity Association and eventually was shuttered. To save time and sanity, we will always refrain from discussing the plots of the silly, ridiculous plots of the 1920s revues. Despite the forced closure of La La Lucille, George once again dusted himself off and started all over again. The dance team he had worked with in the Follies some years before, Ann Pennington and Jack Donahue, had decided to set up as competitors to Ziegfeld, and the George White scandals emerged in 1919. A contract was signed between the two Georges in February 1920 for Gershwin to write the music and Buddy DeSilva to write the lyrics. White was so pleased that he renewed the contract 4 more times, and the team wrote 5 consecutive scandals from 1920 to 1924. George later said that writing under pressure was a valuable experience for him, and that he was able to experiment with a variety of styles and harmonic innovations. The most highly regarded of all of George's songs for White was 1922's I'll Build a Stairway to Paradise. This spectacular number closes the first act, and Gershwin later recalled the pleasure given to an audience by 2 enormous circular staircases heading up, surrounded by Paul Whiteman's orchestra and occupied by 50, count them, 50, beautiful tall women in spectacular gowns. It was also the first song in which Ira played a major role in the lyrics. The song has remained a standard in the Gershwin repertoire ever since. The version we will now hear was impressively performed in An American in Paris, the 1951 MGM musical in which a French singer, Georges, and hope I'm pronouncing it nearly right, Guattari, properly attired in hi-hat and tails, ascends a colossal staircase, peopled also by lovely ladies, presumably on his way to paradise. It may be over the top, yes, it is over the top, but it was chosen because it does seem to reproduce the way it would have been staged by George White in the scandals of 1922, in the same way that, given the artistic growth of Al Jolson, that 1945 version was exactly like his 1920 version. Song time.
Sing the song chanson. C'est Paris, c'est Montmartre, c'est Robinson. C'est le jour qui s'éveille comme un pinson. Ah, l'amour est là dans mon cœur. Ah, quel grand bonheur. C'est le... Johnny, comment ça va? How are you? Excusez-moi, mesdames et messieurs, c'était bien américain. It's madness to be always sitting around in sadness. Oh, when you could be learning the steps of gladness, you'll be happy when you can do just 6 or 7. Begin today, you find it nice. The quickest way to paradise. When you practice, here's the thing to do. Simply say Hasil I'll build a stairway to paradise with a new step every day. I'm going to get there at any price. Stand aside, I'm on my way. I've got the blues and up above it's all fair. Shoes gonna carry me there. I'll build a stairway to paradise with a new step every day. I'll build a stairway to paradise with a new step every day. I'm going to get there at any price. Stand aside, I'm on my way. I've got the blues on up above, it's all fair. Shoes gonna carry me there. I'll build a stairway to paradise with a new step every day. With a new step every day.
George was writing for the George White Scandals from 1920 to 24, but that was hardly enough for him to be up to. He was very energetic, very determined. In 1921, George and Ira, now a full-time lyricist for his brother, provided the score for a new musical, A Dangerous Maid. There is no surviving book and the score was discarded, but 2 songs were interpolated into an Ed Wynn vehicle called The Perfect Fool, and which did enjoy a long run in a national tour. The next year, George, again with Buddy DeSilva, wrote some songs for the French Doll. That same year, he and lyricist William Daly collaborated on a score for a musical with a rather unpromising chorus of 11 rustic maidens and 6 farm boys. The title was even more impressive. Our Nell, a jazzy melodrama set in England, was as subtle as the title and died in early death. In 1923, George continued to receive assignments from various and many sources. He provided music for a silent Western film, The Sunshine Trail. He also contributed a few lost songs to the Sigmund Romberg Marie Dressler review, The Dancing Girl. He made his first trip to London, crossed the Atlantic, to write an original review, The Rainbow, which didn't succeed. The British people didn't feel that it was British enough. Commissions kept on coming. Some songs were written for a couple of shows, Little Miss Bluebeard and Nifties of 1923. And he found the time and energy to join once again with Buddy DeSilva to write Sweet Little Devil. There were many reviews put on Broadway any particular year in the 20s, so the fact that he wrote this many in the same year was not particularly odd. They would open and they would close and be replaced fairly quickly with another one. George Gershwin was clearly to be found in the Rolodex of every Broadway producer, and his card was becoming tattered. A brief note on the collaboration style of George and Ira. Elton John can't write a lyric. He can't write a single lyric and never has. He sits by the mailbox, perhaps sadly staring into the distance, until he receives a poem from Bernie Taupin. Then he sits down and composes a brilliant melody and an orchestration. The Gershwins did it the other way. George would write the music, and then pass it along to Ira, who always lived within a block or two, sometimes downstairs from George. And Ira would write the lyric. Occasionally, Ira would say, I need another beat in that line to fit a better lyric, and George would happily do so, or to cut it off. All their lives, the brothers were extraordinarily close. Ira might have been the only human being with whom George was relaxed and comfortable. There was rarely, if ever, tension or hard feelings between them. It was a remarkable relationship. I think the advantage is that they both wholly concurred that George was the dominant partner in the relationship. That was something George required, and Ira was perfectly happy to deal with. Ira's wife, Lenore, was never happy with this relationship and was always jealous and a bit angry at George. Thank you. George's most serious relationship with a woman, and God knows he had many opportunities, was with a composer named Kay Swift. She divorced her husband to make it possible for her to marry. We'll have a picture of her later. Who divorced her husband in the hope that that would make it more possible for George to marry her. But as always, George escaped any close relationship, any intimate relationship. The next year, 1924, saw the second defining moment for George. The first was Swanee, of course, when Paul Whiteman commissioned for his February 12th Aeolian Hall concert a composition that has become Gershwin's hallmark. I think you all know this concert and all know the hallmark. It's one of the essential creations of all 20th century art. This, of course, is the iconic Rhapsody in Blue. George was completely unknown to the classical music world, not having yet written anything for it. And he was supremely interested in serious music and felt a little insecure about his abilities. Tried every now and then to see if he could increase his skills and knowledge of techniques. Paul Whiteman facilitated George's prospects by inviting to the concert, as he called it, the big guns in classical music. And such titans as Walter Damrosch, Leopold Stokowski, Jascha Heifetz, Amelita Galigurci, and John McCormack were among the sold-out audience for Whiteman's brilliant and inventive and experiment in modern music. There were many accounts about the swiftness with which Gershwin completed the Rhapsody, but it is known that it was not begun much in advance, and was only completed 10 days before the concert date. Whiteman's arranger, Ferdy Groffet, was promptly seated at George's apartment every day to orchestrate the piece. George was not quite ready to orchestrate. It proved the sensation of the concert and was greeted by tumultuous applause, and George, as a soloist, received 3 curtain calls. Paul Whiteman may not have been the king of jazz, but he certainly knew how to ride a hot hand, and immediately scheduled an energetic concert tour. Throughout 1924 and 25, the Rhapsody was performed to highly appreciative audiences, with George mostly a solo pianist. In 1926, this time without Gershwin, Whiteman embarked on a European tour to perform the Rhapsody, where it was received with great joy and ticket purchases. In short order, George Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue became the preeminent concert work of its time. The English music critic Ernest Newman, who did not consider him at all an admirer of jazz, described the work as, open quote, a creditable first attempt to do something bigger than jazz by a gifted young man with an enviable facility in producing catchy, pungent tunes. The Rhapsody has never lost its exalted place in the repertoire. If any of you remember the 1984 Olympics, the opening ceremony of the '84 Olympics consisted of 84 pianos played by 84 pianists, the Rhapsody in Blue. Whatever could be more Los Angeles or Busby Berkeleyan than that? With the completion of the score for the Scandals of 1924, Gershwin and De Silva's exertions for George White were concluded. Critics found their 1924 edition increasingly conventional, uninspired, and commonplace. Clearly, the composer and the lyricist were getting a bit bored doing this. There is one clear exception of the 1924 George White Scandals, Somebody Loves Me, a spectacular song. The song's verse, both novel and provocative, reflected the contrast between a comfortable "somebody loves me" and perhaps the regret of not knowing who. Continuing his remarkable year of 1924, Gershwin was sent back to England by Ahrens and Freedley to provide a few songs for the London musical Primrose. This time George did better in Englishing it up, and the show ran in London for 255 performances. His publisher Harms put out a complete piano vocal score, making it one of the best preserved of George's early scores. While in London, still in 1924, the producers arranged a meeting between George and Fred Astaire to discuss a new Broadway musical for the fall. George and Ira completed the score over the summer and titled it Lady Be Good. It was an enormous success, and the work ripened into one of the quintessential American theatrical works of the 1920s. In addition to Fred and his sister Adele, its cast also included Ukulele Ike, Cliff Edwards, and the duo piano team of Victor Arden and Phil Oman. Improbably, one of the songs Gershwin wrote for the play, The Man I Love, was dropped from the show because it was considered too subtle for a review that emphasized manic stage movement and fast-paced dialogue. Critics found the show demented, lunatic, hysterical, and blissfully idiotic. These were accolades, not disparagements. Opening on December 1, Lady Be Good was relished by reviewers and audiences alike. While the music was found exciting, the triumph of the evening were the siblings Astaire's, now recognized as musical comedy stars of the first magnitude. This was the first George and Ira Gershwin show to have a full national tour, followed by a London run. You can imagine how much more money that makes for a musical. It was the first major theatrical success for the young, aging 26-year-old composer and his lyricist brother. Lady Be Good contained two songs that have proven enduring, the title song and Fascinating Rhythm. Let's listen to original cast members Fred and Adele make a pass at it. They were both much better hoofers than vocalists, but you can easily hear that Fred was Caruso compared to Adele's painfully thin voice. The accompanist is the composer.
Each morning I
George couldn't and wouldn't slow down in 1925. He collaborated with Buddy DeSilva and Ira on a musical comedy called Tell Me More. The cast was found unworthy of the music and then closed after 100 performances. A superior cast was found for the London run, and there it ran for 262 performances. The entire production has fallen into merited obscurity. In the summer of 1925, George began work on his second substantial composition for the Classical Concert Hall, which regrettably would be his only concerto. Walter Damrosch, conductor of the New York Symphony Society, a competitor at that time of the New York Philharmonic, but several years later the Philharmonic bought them out and left only one major orchestra in New York. George was motivated to prove that he was more than just a composer of reviews. Many persons have thought, he said, that the Rhapsody was only a happy accident. Well, I went out there to show that there was plenty more where that had come from. From the silence and isolation of a rural cabin in upstate New York, he completed the movements in August and September. He was now confident in his ability to orchestrate his music, and he did so himself. By the first week of November, the Piano Concerto in F was ready. Much more than the Rhapsody, the concerto reflected 19th century classical music traditions. The orchestration was a little less conventional, included untraditional percussion instruments such as the woodblock, bells, slapstick, and xylophone, fairly common percussion instruments during the acoustic era. It was first publicly performed at Carnegie Hall on December 5th, surrounded by classical music such as by Gluck and Glazunov. The mixed audience of classical music lovers and theater jazz enthusiasts eagerly greeted the concerto. It has now taken its place in the international portfolio and has been performed and recorded by many principal orchestras of the world. Next. We're not going to be listening to Tchaikovsky's, but I thought it was a nice picture of the three of them. We will now listen to Oscar Levant's dream orchestra of his favorite players, and his dream pianist playing the piano, and his dream conductor conducting the piece. Levant early on had come under Gershwin's spell and had established himself as one of the preeminent interpreters of Gershwin's music. As had Ira, Levant chose to submerge himself within the enormous shadow of Gershwin's superior talent. This is another clip from 1951's An American in Paris. It's a movement from the Concerto in F. wanted to be a classical composer. He wanted also to be a revue composer, but he really wanted to be respected by classical composers. But he did understand that it was on Broadway and not Carnegie Hall that his meal ticket was paid. You could never make that kind of money unless... In December 1925, the team from Lady Be Good was reunited with Ahrens and Friedli and Gershwin collaborating once again. Tiptoes was conceived as a vehicle for Queenie Smith, a very tiny dancer who had danced for the Metropolitan Opera but then moved over to Broadway. She was given a sweet score, and it was a customary romantic farce. A critic wrote, "It was a hopeful and expectant audience that swarmed last night into the Liberty Theater, but not because Queenie Smith whirled about on her toes or because Mr. Ahrens was the producer. Their major consideration was that George Gershwin wrote the music." And by this time, Ira's lyrics began to receive substantial recognition on its own. He received a little note from Lorenz Hart, another fairly decent lyricist. "Your lyrics gave me as much pleasure as Mr. George Gershwin's music. Such delicacies as your jingles prove that songs can be both popular and intelligent." It ran for 194 performances before what was becoming a customary national tour and a successful invasion of England. 1926 was not quite the frenetic pace of the previous 2 years, certainly not if measured by, say, numerical productivity. He continued to stretch his serious side, writing 5 preludes for piano. He had attended a debate on the question of jazz, the savage music of intellectual and spiritual debauchery, should be outlawed. The negative side pleased the composer in the audience and by saying, "When I die, George Gershwin should be played, the Rhapsody in Blue, at my funeral." 1926 did see the creation of a major work for Broadway, specifically written for the English actress Gertrude Lawrence. OK was a production of Ahrens and Friedli and a score by the Gershwin brothers with a book by Guy Bolton and P.G. Wodehouse. The show received excellent reviews, especially Miss Lawrence, who was described as suavely gleeful and politely indiscreet. Opening on November 8th, it ran for 256 performances before a national tour, and then 214 more performances in London. OK integrated book and score more compellingly than any review before had, but it must be said it still remained for Showboat the next year to demonstrate how the connection could be perfected. 2 songs stood out, Do Do Do, which has become Gertrude Lawrence's key song, and the superior, Someone to Watch Over Me, which if I had 2 hours to present, you'd be hearing that now. A thought for the future, which was recorded by George on Columbia 812-D at a few days subsequent to the opening. If you hear that record, and some of you may have it, it's exactly as he played at the time. Next. 1927 began for the Gershwin brothers with a collaboration with the famous wit George S. Kaufman, Strike Up the Band. This seemingly brilliant team produced one of the trio's worst flops. Kaufman, a caustic satirist, said he never entirely felt home with musicals. As Ira wrote about him, Kaufman, well, he didn't hate music. Even in musicals, he regarded music as a necessary evil. Tryouts went poorly with second act struggles, star departures, and dwindling attendance. It never made it to Broadway, despite all the star power. However, in 1930, a couple of years later, the producers ripped up the book and replaced Kaufman with Maury Riskind, another great wit playwright, and found a new cast. The fierce satire and Kaufman bitterness were lightened from the plot, and the Gershwins made their score livelier and funnier. It finally opened on January 14th, 1930, and this time, Strike Up the Band passably flourished and ran for 6 months. The one hit from the show was the title song. The Man I Love was once again scratched. It's astonished to me. Because The Man I Love was scratched, it didn't have 2 hits. Funny face, next. Following the failure of the 1927 version of Strike Up the Band, George and Ira returned to the more familiar Ahrens and Friedli and Fred and Adele. It was called Funny Face. Once again, previews were seriously problematic. Richard Rodgers wrote to his wife, "God will have to do miracles if it's fixed." This time, with 6 weeks of continuous adjustments with recasting, rewriting, rehearsing, and finally rejoicing, it led to a successful Broadway opening. One number added to the score obligated Astaire to make his very first appearance in Top Hat and Tails, fronting a similarly attired male dance group. Fred apparently liked the look. 3 songs stood out from the score: He Loves and She Loves, a particularly beautiful love song, The Babbitt and the Bromide, and the classic Swonderful, which I think is the only song in the greatest 100 hits on Library of Congress to begin with a grammatical point rather than a letter. Ira spent the balance of his life trying to stop singers from saying "it's wonderful." He hated when he heard it, and he heard it often enough, but he felt it ruined the beat and the meter of his line. Among the unanimous reviews of acclaim was one by Alexander Woollcott, who you may remember as the man who came to dinner in a movie made about 10 years later. "I do not know if Gershwin was born into this world to write rhythms for Fred Astaire's feet, or whether Astaire was born into this world to show how the Gershwin's music can be danced." Or whatever the reply, Funny Face ran for 244 performances. Next. Less than 2 months after Funny Face debuted, the brothers were hired by Ziegfeld to write the music for his new show, Rosalie, which is not the same as the 1935 Rosalie with Eleanor Powell. Most of the music for that was written by Cole Porter. Sigmund Romberg was co-composer, which is kind of an odd combination, and P.G. Wodehouse co-lyricist. Because of the obligation to frequently revise Funny Face, Gershwin found his creative time cut, and for the first time found himself out of time. He tried to extricate himself from the show. Ziegfeld said, "Don't leave, George. Give me some really nice songs for the show." So the Gershwins hit their trunk back in the apartment and found some old songs and gave them 23 of them, 10 of which were chosen. Even the song unceremoniously booted from 2 previous scores, "The Man I Love," found a home in Rosalie and began its splendid march to melodic immortality. Rosalie was a remarkable success for Ziegfeld despite his investment of 60 players in the orchestra and 64 in the chorus. It reached New York at the New Amsterdam Theater and ran for 327 performances. 1928 resumed with another flop, as Treasure Girl opened to dismal reviews and closed after 68 performances. Book and casting were the major hitches. Billboard found the book vapid, humorless, and absolutely inane. The casting of Gertrude Lawrence, which was such a success in OK, failed. The role required someone from a 1937 fast-paced comedy, like the Front Page, or My Girl Friday, I think it was called, My Girl Friday. And that was not Gertrude Lawrence's strength. Next. George, that's probably my favorite photograph of George, and probably one you've all seen many times. George, Ira, and Ira's wife, Lenore, who didn't like George very much, overlooked this failure with a 15-week European tour. George hoped to, quote, again looking for classical improvement, "benefit my technique as much as possible from a study of European orchestral methods." While he did meet with such European giants as Kurt Weill and his wife Lottie Lenya, and Sergei Prokofiev and Sergei Rachmaninoff, he was never able to find a tutor willing to change any of his techniques. That is something that he tried 3 or 4 times in his life, to find a very well-known classical teacher or composer, but nobody would take him on. They said, "What you have, I don't want to ruin." This time was well used, however, because of the opportunity to experience Paris. You might know what's coming next. Far from the comforts of his customary New York City apartment, Walter Damrosch, who had commissioned the Concerto in F, wanted him to write another serious work, and George chose the tone poem based on the French capital, a suitable subject for what developed into An American in Paris. A tone poem refers to a piece of music for orchestra that represents a story, an image, a mood, and customarily follows a program or a story, or just Beethoven's Sixth Symphony is not a tone poem, but it is programmatic in that it follows a story. There's people doing this in this movement, or people doing that in that movement in sheep. Next. An American in Paris comprises 5 sections, each with its own theme. The score was completed on August 1, and George's orchestration was finished a couple of weeks before the December 13th world premiere. George scored the piece creatively and richly and included such orchestral rarities as a baritone saxophone, a bass clarinet, bells, a triangle, a woodblock, and of course, unique taxi horns, which Gershwin had brought back from Paris. Reviews were excellent, and it was generally deemed better crafted and less pretentious over the concerto in F. Other orchestras soon took up the piece, and it was added to the permanent repertoire. This tone poem has become one of the most performed and recorded orchestral works of the 20th century, and it had actually been one of the most choreographed works of the 20th century. There are many choreographers who have turned parts of it into a ballet, especially the slow scene, which was used in American in Paris, the movie with Leslie Caron and Gene Kelly dancing slowly to that magnificent blues melody. Next. You should recognize at least one of those 3 men, and if you do, you probably recognize all 3. Early in 1929, Ziegfeld once again came a-calling on the Gershwin brothers for still another backstage musical to be called Showgirl. Casting included the comic trio of Lou Clayton, Eddie Jackson, and Jimmy Durante, as well as a 19-year-old native, and here's some CanCon at long last, Dartmouth, North Nova Scotia, Ruby Keeler. Unlike their experience with Rosalie the previous year, the Gershwin struggled vitally with Ziegfeld, the producer. He wanted them to complete the score extremely swiftly so he can get it on stage faster, something Gershwin described as a rush job. Then Ziegfeld hired the lyricist Gus Kahn to help out Ira Gershwin because he didn't quite have the faith in Ira he should have. Ziegfeld had little interest in plot or character development and wanted as many songs as possible to be played as quickly as possible. Even though Gershwin offered 25 new songs, and 13 of those made it into the show, Ziegfeld found them distinctly under par, and the work of a tired man, or else a lazy man. He then directed George and Ira to be physically present to revise any revisions that were required. They had enough of this particular producer and refused. Ziegfeld then had his lawyer write to George telling him that some of his royalty payments would be withheld, and then went about hiring Vincent Youmans, of all people, to doctor the score. The result was neither a flop nor a hit. There is one song that was well received at the time and still is today, and that's Liza. Liza, by the way, was in the 1935 musical comedy, and it's danced by Eleanor Powell on a bunch of high drums. Girl Crazy. Next. In 1930, the Gershwins returned to more congenial producers, Ahrens and Friedley, and a writer they knew and respected, Guy Bolton. This Gershwin musical takes place on a dude ranch and contains a few cowboy songs. But you can't keep George Gershwin down on the dude ranch after he's seen Paris, and he produced 4 remarkable standards for Girl Crazy, if you think about it, for a dude ranch. Bidin' My Time, But Not For Me, Embraceable You, and I Got Rhythm. Ethel Merman was only 21 and making her Broadway debut. Not for the last time, yeah, you can do it. She stole the show, and I Got Rhythm became her signature tune. She is one of the last of the great note holders. Also in the cast was 19-year-old Ginger Rogers, just starting out on her career. Girl Crazy opened in New York at the Elgin Theater in October of 1930. Merman became an immediate supernova, and pandemonium would erupt in the audience when she belted out her patent extended notes, and calls for encores were a nightly feature. It ran for 272 performances on Broadway, but unfortunately the Depression prevented a national and a European tour. We will view not Ethel Merman, because I couldn't find a really good Ethel Merman cut that, from that era that played it with some interesting visuals. So we'll look at someone who's not too bad either, Thomas Fatzwaller, and his rhythm from 1935. The song grades as one of the most covered, especially by jazzmen, of all of George's songs. With sound coming, many composers got on a train across and ended up in Hollywood because the paydays were a whole lot better over there, and it was a lot easier to work over there. Cole Porter went westward in '29 and Irving Berlin in 1930. But George and Ira weren't exactly dying to go there, but when RKO offered them $100,000 plus first-class round-trip travel for only 14 weeks of work, they decided to maybe give it a chance. I don't think Gershwin really liked the experience in the least. He felt that the moguls who ran Hollywood ran the music also, and that anything they produced could be and was cut, revised or maimed by businessmen pretty much uninformed in music. The only thing he really liked about that trip was that he liked to play tennis outdoors in California, but he longed to return to New York, which they did as soon as they possibly could. George wrote, quote, "I was very disappointed in the picture we wrote. It could have been so swellable. I've never seen that word any other place. If some imagination was used in producing and utilizing it." A critic agreed. Gershwin is said to have written the music involved, but you'd never know it. It took 5 years to get the Gershwins back to California. It opened in December of 1931 and died on arrival. They got back to New York and got back to Broadway as fast as they could. They hooked up again with George S. Kaufman and Maury Riskin on still another political satire they called Of Thee I Sing. Here we go. This time the writers made sure they would have a romantic relationship and that they would reduce the cynical political story. The brothers correspondingly blended the romantic and the satirical in ways that surpassed anything they had previously attempted. The revolutionary thing about this play is that instead of having dialogue, a song, and then some more dialogue, one scene would be all dialogue, the next scene would be all music, the next scene would be all dialogue, the next scene would be all music, which was revolutionary at the time. It opened at the Music Box Theater before a star-studded audience. Critics used singular words: watershed, classic, milestone, and landmark in recognizing this successful reconfiguring of the musical comedy genre. Because the songs were so tightly coupled to the book and furthered the plot, they were a bit less melodic and have not come down to us quite as well. But however, everybody loved it, and it ran for more performances than any other Gershwin play, 441. Interestingly, Kaufman, Riskin, and Ira Gershwin all won the Pulitzer Prize that year for this play. But George did not, because composers were not eligible for the Pulitzer Prize that year. Ira was so furious about the slight to his brother that he hung up his award in his bathroom. It wasn't until 1944 that the Pulitzer Committee began to award the prize also to the composers of musical comedies. The first was won by Richard Rodgers for Oklahoma in 1944, and the second was won by Richard Rodgers for South Pacific. Just briefly, in 1932, the publisher of Random House, Bennett Cerf, put out the George Gershwin Songbook, which contained 18 of his songs organized chronologically. It had some very nice Art Deco drawings, too, by a illustrator, Konstantina Alazhelov. You can see some of it on the right. The book itself is not terribly important, but what is important is that you could probably find about 60 or 70 LPs by very good people called the George Gershwin Songbook, which they got from this book, which they chose the songs from this book. So you see Ella Fitzgerald's George Gershwin Songbook, etc. Every winter he would go down to Florida to exercise for a couple of months, but this time he went to Havana to relax, to play tennis and nightclub. And that led to his next serious composition. He was enthralled with the local music. He wrote, "Cuba was most interesting to me, especially the small dance orchestra, who played the most intricate rhythms, most naturally. Upon his return to New York, he continued his Cuban studies by catching the latest phenomenon, Xavier Cugat and his orchestra at the Waldorf Astoria. Cugat wrote in his memoir that Gershwin would listen to my band as if he were making mental notes." Oh yeah. Several times he invited the boys in the band to visit his Riverside Drive apartment where we would have a jam session with George sitting in at the piano. A rumba orchestra attained its singular resonance via its percussion ensemble. And like the Parisian taxi horns, George returned from Havana with a pile of Cuban percussion instruments and set about using them in an orchestral piece. The work was completed over the summer of 1932, and the New York Philharmonic, since the other orchestra no longer existed, performed its premiere at Lewiston Stadium in August. This was the Cuban Overture, which consists of a single movement of 3 sections. George's orchestration included bongos, gourd, maracas, and Cuban sticks to provide the rumba flavor. The grouping was emphasized further by their placement right in front of the conductor stand. You couldn't miss the the players. That success was followed by another Broadway disaster. You can move to the next one. Ahrens and Friedley engaged the Gershwin brothers and Maury Riskin to write a new musical comedy, specifically for the debonair English musical star Jack Buchanan, who was in, I believe, a couple of movies, one with Fred Astaire and Nanette Fabray. I can't remember the title. To write a new musical for Jack Buchanan. The musical began with troubles, progressed to tribulations, and finished in disaster. The Gershwin brothers were pessimistic as regards the book about a dual personality, though I could see it called Il Schizophreno, perhaps, for the big duet, but accepted the commission to help out Ahrens, who was nearly broke. It was the Depression. The October opening had to be delayed because of multiple snags, and the preview audiences were unimpressed by the musical complexity of Gershwin's score. Buchanan was the smartest one. He bought himself out of the contract way early in the process and was replaced, if any of you know radio comics, sort of so-called comics, Jack Pearl, whose famous code word was, "Was you there, Charlie?" which gets you an idea of the man's wit. He replaced Buchanan, and when it made it to Broadway in January of '33, it received the worst notices of any musical of Gershwin's career. Tedious, lifeless, silly, complicated, boring, and shambles were the general words. Not a surprising result, I think, when you write a musical specifically for a particular artist and the artist leaves. The show managed 46 performances, and much money was lost at an inconvenient time for all concerned. Jack Buchanan was the only one who got out unscathed, but he had to pay $20,000 to get out. Next one. Later in 1932, George S. Kaufman suggested they get together again and write a sequel. I don't think they meant to write it in the barn, but they wanted to write a sequel to the lucrative Of Thee I Sing. The score for Let 'Em Eat Cake was completed and rehearsals began, with the show opening on October 21st. It turned out to be a caustic satire in the astringent Kaufman mode, much darker than its predecessor. They had produced a fantasy about perhaps a fantasy, about a totalitarian America, and the book took no prisoners. The love interest was eliminated, and George wrote the most acerbic musical comedy score of his career, often spiked with pungent dissonance. I wondered what these people were thinking. They wrote one of these and it tanked. They wrote one a little more accessible and it made a fortune, so they go back to the tank thing. It struck me as odd. I don't know what their reasoning was. Critics said, for all I know, the music may be great stuff, but you can't whistle to it or take it out for dancing in the streets. It didn't have a good beat and you couldn't dance to it. Audience seemed to agree, and Time magazine described it as an embarrassing dearth of applause. It managed 90 performances and guaranteed that George and Ira and George S. and Maury would not try another kick at the can. Next. This you might recognize. While this most recent show was tanking on Broadway, Gershwin and the Leo Reisman Orchestra jointly planned an extensive road tour to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the Rhapsody in Blue. In addition, George had written a new serious work for piano and orchestra composed specifically the variations on I Got Rhythm. This was written in the traditional classical theme and variation, where you would basically lay out a theme and then write a certain number of variations on that theme in various keys and various moods. Leo Reisman unfortunately broke his hip prior to the tour, but his orchestra soldiered on with substitute conductor Charles Previn, the great uncle of Andre Previn. Beginning in January 1934, the tour stopped in 28 cities in 29 days. They covered so many cities. They covered every city they could find that they even had one left over for Toronto. And they came on January 19th for a performance at Massey Hall. I believe David Lennox, his mother, attended that. I presume she enjoyed it.
She kept the program.
She did keep the program, and David's, he sent it to me via email, but I'd already found one with George's signature on it. Attendance was consistently good, but they had too many bookings in too many cities and too many small venues, and they ended up with a financial deficit. Critics were generally positive. The quote in the Toronto Mail was, Gershwin's music had two vital elements of art, truth and intelligence. Besides that, it was great fun. George was disheartened that the audiences were made uncomfortable by the complexity and the occasional dissonance of the variations, and critics pretty much didn't mention it. Perhaps they even walked out on it. We have now come to the last, but not least, of George Gershwin's extraordinary works in the classical form. In 1925, DuBose Hayward, a writer born in Charleston, South Carolina, published a novel called Porgy, based on his close contact with the local Gullah population. These people live on the Sea Islands just off of Georgia and South Carolina. And it's quite a closed group in the 1930s. They had had pretty much the same culture they had for several hundred years, ever since slavery had ended. The next year, DuBose Hayward's wife, Dorothy, adapted Porgy for the stage. It quickly became one of the Theater Guild's most successful productions, and with long runs on Broadway and in London. The three writers of Porgy and Bess. George had long thought of writing an opera, maybe a folk opera, maybe a Negro folk opera. He read the novel early on and immediately contacted Hayward and his wife about adapting it. The Haywards were encouraging, but George didn't feel quite sure enough of his ability to write in what is probably the most difficult genre of classical music, where you do the words, you do the orchestration, and even the stage directions. It wasn't until 7 years later, in 1932, that George and Hayward finally resolved to get it done. In a couple of short visits, George had reportedly transformed himself into a, quote, eager student of Negro music, and wrote Hayward in February 1934 they had begun composing music for the first act. The first song he completed has come down to us also, and that was Summertime. That spring, he and Hayward worked together, but at long distance. Hayward once again reminded George that he really hasn't scratched the surface of the native material yet. George agreed, and that summer spent 5 weeks on Folly Island, just off the coast, and 10 miles from Charleston. There they collaborated by days, while George spent his evenings attending church services and recitals and immersing himself in Black Southern culture. By January 1935, George had completed a draft of the score, which he described as perhaps the most difficult but most rewarding endeavor of his career. Next. The score and orchestration were successfully completed by the summer of 1935. George was very, very invested in the success of this, and even took on the job of casting, which meant he had to go all over the country finding black singers who had had operatic training. Since black singers were not permitted to sing for the Metropolitan Opera or any other opera they could think of, there weren't that many operatic trained black singers. But he scoured everywhere and found enough for his soloists. His two stars, Todd Duncan as Porgy and Annie Brown as Bess, were both very well educated and experienced singers. The libretto for Porgy and Bess was an uncommon semi-collaboration between DuBose Hayward and Ira, in which they worked on an individual song separately, but every now and then, when someone helped out the other one on some part where they were blocked, they took a co-writing credit. Porgy and Bess opened at the Alvin Theater on October 10th, 1935. One aria after another received thunderous applause. There were 7 curtain calls for the cast, a few more for the Gershwin brothers and Hayward. After the performance, a reception was held at the penthouse apartment of publisher Condé Nast for 400 invited guests. It ran for 124 performances, an exceptional accomplishment for an opera. Porgy and Bess took a few years to be fully accepted, and Gershwin had concerns about its legacy. Had he lived a bit longer, he would have been reassured of its distinguished and permanent place in the repertoire. I gave some thought to waking you all up at this part in the presentation. Maybe do some Janis Joplin, her Summertime, which, by the way, I think is an excellent cover. But I actually had an opportunity to have the original cast in a film scene, and I think that might work even better. Annie Brown is the soloist here, but you also see Todd Duncan as Porgy. Ready for Summertime? two on the is it just to his death? In order just to try and get this finished before you all die of starvation, I'm going to cut the next Hollywood trip a little bit, but you'll see it in the article I'll be writing for the newsletter. They returned to Hollywood in 1937 under a contract with RKO for two movies, one movie and one option for another movie. The first one was Shall We Dance, which was for Astaire, and was quite a success even though it made less money than Fred Astaire's other movies. They completed the score in early December of 1936. The writers devised a scenario at George's request that would allow some of his music to be played without words. And if you've ever seen that movie, there's some excellent numbers just with George dancing, perhaps in one where he's dancing underneath on the bottom of the ship, around the machinery of the bottom, along with a bunch of black dancers. Four wonderful songs from the movie are still with us. Slap That Bass, another song that for Fred to dance to, a fairly good song. Let's Call the Whole Thing Off, a duet between Ginger and Fred. They Can't Take That Away From Me, another fairly decent song, and the title song. George complained that everyone from the director to the key grip wanted to put in their oars, requesting one rewrite after another. But they mostly held their own, and it received excellent reviews. Unfortunately, it made less money than the other Astaire Rogers movies. The second movie, when RKO picked up the second film, was called A Damsel in Distress. And if you want to hear about a bad idea, Ginger Rogers was not in this. There was no dancer, there was no singer for Fred's romantic lead. Instead, they gave him 19-year-old Joan Fontaine, which is an insane idea. She was a bit of an actress at that point. Oliver de Havilland's sister, I believe. Astaire pleaded that she be replaced. The woman could not sing, she could not dance, and wasn't much of an actor at that point. Fontaine was miserable. For me, the title of the film was appropriate. Burns and Allen were given more significant prominence, and two songs achieved immediate and long-term success. A Foggy Day in London Town, and Nice Work If You Can Get It. Alas, movie audiences were wise to the studio's efforts to endorse Miss Fontaine in this sort of role, and it became the very first movie starring Fred Astaire to lose money. Their contract with RKO completed, another option was not picked up. They heard from, you must know Sam Goldwyn, Mr. Malaprop. He approached them. He wanted to be the new Ziegfeld in Hollywood. He wanted to be the new George White, because he was going to do an annual series of filmed reviews with casts assembled from everywhere, radio, vaudeville, ballet, opera, all in glorious Technicolor. Goldwyn was going to call these things, as in his usual modest manner, the Goldwyn Follies. George readied 5 songs, and sadly the last 5 he would ever write, which included 2 of the finest he ever wrote, Love Walked In and Our Love Is Here to Stay. The producer looked over these treasures, Our Love Is Here to Stay, Love Walked In, and says, why don't you write hit songs like Irving Berlin does? Oscar Levant, who was present, recalled that it was one of the few occasions in my experience when George was genuinely angry. Next one. George died before the score could be completed. Goldwyn, never a moral paragon, decided to fire Ira because he claimed their joint contract had ended with George's death. And then he hired another composer to fool around with the music, to doctor the score. When the movie was delivered, it became the one and only Goldwyn ever made because it died on arrival. Our Love and Here to Stay was the last song Gershwin ever wrote. His dreams of writing a symphony and a string quartet, of collaborating again with Kaufman and Riskind, of writing another opera with Hayward, all these to our great loss remain undone. No sketches for any of these pipe dreams have ever been found. In February 1937, and you can go to the next one now, George Gershwin was 38 years old and 5 months. He was a trim, energetic man in excellent physical condition. Every apartment that he bought, he constructed a gymnasium. When he was traveling in Florida or California, he would spend a lot of time on the tennis court. There was no reason to think that he would not be around for many years to continue sharing his gifts with the world. He was a lucky man, whose life of good timing and great talent must infinitely go on. February of 1937, George Gershwin was playing Concerto in F for the Los Angeles Symphony Orchestra when his mind went blank, and he uncharacteristically forgot several bars of the score. He recovered sufficiently to resume playing and finish the concerto. But soon afterwards, he began experiencing pungent odors similar to the smell of burning rubber. He consulted his psychiatrist, who recommended a medical checkup, during which nothing was found. But as he continued to experience these unpleasant olfactory hallucinations, in addition to headaches, dizzy spells, and blackouts, he was again referred to a physician, who examined him on June 9th and ordered an EEG, urine analysis, blood work, and other tests. Once again, no abnormalities were found. But due to these symptoms, he was soon punted to a neurologist, who saw him 2 weeks later. George was then transferred to the Cedars of Lebanon Hospital for more elaborate tests. He refused a lumbar puncture, a spinal tap, and the sum total of investigations was inconclusive. George was released from the hospital on June 26 with a diagnosis of most likely hysteria, which is something I think many of his friends believed. One day when he was having trouble holding on to things, he dropped a big glass of what he was drinking on the floor during a party given by Ira's wife, Leonora. She screamed and yelled at him for dropping it and threw him out of the place. Things rapidly deteriorated and his worsening condition became dangerous. His motor coordination deteriorated and he could be seen stumbling upstairs, dropping objects, and spilling liquids. He became listless, and in the unkindest cut of all, he forgot how to play the piano. I can't imagine anything more cruel for him. On July 4th, he and a male nurse moved into the quiet and empty home of his long-term friend, Yip Harburg. That home was later bought by Rosemary Clooney, and Ira Gershwin bought the house next door when he finally moved permanently to Hollywood. I don't know why he did. It just seems like Ira wouldn't want to be remembered for that. You can move to the next. Providentially, I think, he fell into a coma and was rushed back to Cedars of Lebanon, never again to regain consciousness. At this time, he was administered a lumbar puncture, which showed unambiguous evidence of a brain tumor. The ever-lucky man had an end to his fortune. A neurosurgeon was flown in to operate during the early morning hours of July 11th. The procedure lasted 5 hours and a tumor was actually found in the right temporal lobe. The surgeon was able to remove a large glioblastoma mass, but it was far too late and he died several hours after the surgery. There have been several articles, especially one in the New York Times, about what modern medical technology, surgical techniques might have done. And the general decision is it might have given him another year, it might have given him another 2 years, but with diminishing capabilities and diminishing abilities, it would not probably produce much more music. If you remember John McCain at the end, he just had to disappear at some point. That would have happened to George. His body was returned to his city, New York, and funeral services were held on July 15th. Nearly 3,500 people jammed into the Temple Emmanuel to pay their respects, while a simultaneous service was held in Los Angeles with a eulogy provided by Oscar Hammerstein. He was buried in the family plot at Mount Hope Cemetery, north of New York City. His mother later converted the plot into a mausoleum, which is still there. At his death, George Gershwin was widely cherished as a writer of elevated popular music. This despite the fact that the lightweight musical comedies from whence his songs came were essentially historical curiosities. His name is not associated at all with the history of American jazz, quite appropriately, I think. You can watch Ken Burns' PBS series over and over for an entire length, and you will not hear George's name mentioned once. This, despite the enormous value jazzmen have placed on his songs, and they find enough in his songs to create some very provocative and very creative jazz interpretations of his music. I can't tell you how many I Got Rhythm copies are to be found by jazz people. Can Gershwin be considered a classical composer at all? He was always mindful of the deficiencies in his formal music education and the lack of acceptance he was given by serious musicians. He was constantly working to improve his knowledge of music and his formal compositional techniques. He had hoped his Concerto in F, his opera, and the smaller works for orchestra would have been assessed as seriously as any composed by Mozart. While he had immense confidence in his own capabilities, as we've seen, it was always undermined by anxieties about how he was perceived by classically trained composers. Next one. Last one. And here's a classical composer at the piano. What we have today is a tragically incomplete sample of his potential. Those who knew him best believed that had he lived longer, he would have written many more works of a classical nature, broadening and deepening his musical legacy. His classical output consisted of one piano concerto, one opera, one rhapsody, one tone poem, and a few smaller works. In a world that loves to put people in neatly defined boxes, George Gershwin defied characterization. He was sui generis. Generis? Sui generis. Perhaps one can argue that Leonard Bernstein joins him as a member of this classification, but it would be very tenacious to attempt to unearth any other American composer who was so accomplished in so many ways. The novelist John O'Hara, a contemporary of Gershwin's, summed up music lovers' feelings, and I suppose mine. George Gershwin died July 11th, 1937, but I don't have to believe it if I don't want to. Thank you.